climate change is actually a cultural issue, not a scientific issue. Science has been extremely good at identifying the symptoms and looking at the way in which it has manifested itself. But it hasn't really addressed any of the issues in terms of the causes. It has tried to use what you might call techno-fix solution, focused, problem-based approaches to the situation, rather than actually asking deep questions and listening.
Another episode of the Conscient podcast. I'm with David Haley, who's in the UK. Hello, David.
Hello there. Really good to see you, Claude.
Yes, well, we haven't met, but I know about your work, and I've actually quoted you in my episode 19 because I really enjoyed the way you articulated things, and then I read more of your work, and so I'm really happy that we have a moment here to talk about some of the issues around art and climate change and ecological art specifically.
Artist David Haley. We now need aesthetics to sensitize us to other ways of life. And we need artists to sensitize us to the shape of things to come.
But maybe we can start just by a little self-introduction. I'll do a link to your bio so people can know more. But basically, who are you, David Haley? Where do you come from, and what do you do?
Okay, so I'm an artist who makes work with ecology. Since 1992, my practice has focused almost entirely on climate change, as it was then called, species extinction and cultural extinction. I work with communities, I work with academia, I work with anybody who wants to try and understand these issues and act upon them.
Well, you've been active writing, but I think you're also a teacher, or at least you're somebody who works in helping people understand these issues. So maybe we can start with your response to some of the issues that I raised in my reality episode around the notion of reality itself, its relationship to denial, and also ecological grief. Just some starting thoughts on in particular around reality.
Reality is a good issue. Again, it's particularly related to climate change. Let's call it that for now. Mm-hmm. When I first got involved with this issue, it only seemed to be about science, politics, with a little economics thrown in. And I remember from something called Agenda 21, which came out of the Rio summit in 1992, there were three pillars, which were, and these were the pillars of sustainable development. And that was social, economic, and environmental. It's interesting using architectural metaphor of pillars, because in fact what they missed was the lintel, horizontal bar that goes across the top, and that's culture. Because in my opinion, climate change is actually a cultural issue, not a scientific issue. Science has been extremely good at identifying the symptoms and looking at the way in which it has manifested itself. But it hasn't really addressed any of the issues in terms of the causes. And also, in my opinion, it has tried to use what you might call techno-fix solution, focused, problem-based approaches to the situation, rather than actually asking deep questions and listening.
And why would culture have been left out? I've heard that many times, that, or at least culture doesn't play the role that it's not been left out, because there are lots of artists and cultural workers working on the issue. But why is it not taking its rightful place, do you think?
I think that's partly because of a misunderstanding of culture itself. Culture is not just about art. Mm-hmm. Culture is actually, and here we go to the reality, the start of your question. Reality and culture are embedded in each other. They are belief systems that human beings carry. It doesn't matter which society you are in or you come from. Your culture is how you believe the world is. It's your worldview. And it's your worldview that carries through to how you then manage the rest of your life, and how you see yourself within the world.
Fair enough. Well, one of the reasons I bring it up in my research is that I'm a Buddhist, I'm a Zen Buddhist, and we deal with reality all the time, and in a way that the moment is the only moment, is the only thing that we can experience. But metaphorically, when you look at people's inability to seize and do something about the reality of the climate emergency, that's where it becomes problematic for me, because a lot of people are not that they're not aware, like you say, that science is there, the information is there, but somehow culturally, in terms of their lives, they're not able to wrestle with the complexity of the climate emergency. And so that's one of the reasons that I've been, and personally also, I needed to go through a process of ecological grief, because I feel it in my body. I feel that the loss of species, and you talk about extinction, both species extinction, and I assume human extinction is on your radar as well, because it,
yes,
so maybe you could talk about that some more.
But the connection there is the cultural extinction. Mm-hmm. The way in which belief systems have been erased. It's very popular these days to talk about indigenous knowledge and decolonializing the way in which we think and work. And a lot of that arises, I believe, from what I refer to as cultural erasure. In other words, the way in which peoples in different communities around the world think differently. It just as much as we talk about biodiversity, cultural diversity is of equal importance. The monoculture that exists largely through the recent propensity of media monoculture and erases our ability to think beyond the digital medium. And in fact, to a certain extent, I understand some of your Buddhist philosophies and belief systems. I probably practice nearer to Taoist beliefs, which are complementary, shall we say. And to live in the moment is absolutely the only place we can be. However, living in the moment also implies context. And that context is actually a continuum from past through the present to the future. So it's not the present being in this microsecond of me uttering these words. The present is actually a longer concept. I mean, you can go back to Stuart Brand's Clock of the Long Now for that kind of reference.
My dream, as then teacher David Loy suggests, is that one day we can realize our non-duality with nature and begin to live in ways that accord with that realization.
Well, we could talk a long time about these philosophical perspectives, and I find them useful as a grounding to figure out what then to do and to act, because you kind of have to step back in order to move forward. But sure. I just wanted to mention that when I heard about your writing. It was in relation to an event called Becoming Earthly, and you wrote a piece called Going Beyond Earthly. And I use a little quote in the podcast of something you said. We need aesthetics to sensitize us to other ways of life, and we need artists to sensitize us to the shape of things to come. And I just took a little clip out of a much larger thing, but it really got to me, right? It's like, yes, there's an aesthetic side, and there's a sort of a forecasting or a speculation that artists can do. So maybe you could talk a bit more about your work in ecological art. What is it, and how does it sort of fit into the contributions that the arts can and must make to the ecological crisis?
Okay, can we take the word "must" out of there?
Yeah, sure. Must is out.
No, it's just that it's not for me to dictate to other artists how they work and what they should do.
Yeah, nor I.
Good, thank you. However, I recognise that artists, and we can only talk in generalities here, apart from my own personal practice, but artists are also citizens in the world and constrained by many of the issues that everybody is constrained by. The art world, art education, the university's teaching of art, we now see, even across the Eastern world, is now dominated by the Western canon of art, which takes particular philosophies and a particular focus that actually I try to break from. I recognize it. I've studied it for many years. But the constraints on my cognitive abilities to actually react and respond to what I see as the most pressing urgencies makes it very difficult. So from what I see as an eco-pedagogue, many students of art still produce representational art about climate change, about species extinction, rather than being directly engaged with the issues and directly involved in them. So that's kind of one reflection on the way in which the art world takes the subject matter. I remember particularly in 2009, COP15 in Stockholm. And prior to that, there had been 4 years of immense funding support, different things going on to try and promote artists and the cultural sector to be involved in trying to change the minds of political leaders. Of course, COP15 was a complete and utter disaster. And I can remember seeing many of the artists who had taken up the cause at that time falling away very, very quickly because it was like holding a hot potato. They didn't want to know it anymore. I think in terms of where we are now, there's been a much deeper and longer trajectory of a new generation of artists who actually understand and have grown up with these issues. I hope that when we get to COP26 in Glasgow this year, that whatever the outcome, that they will pursue their practices as they wish, and that the whole of humanity looks to actually addressing these issues. I remember once somebody on the Eco Art Network saying, "David, we can't possibly, as artists, save the world." And I just replied, well, actually, as a human being, this is what we need to do.
Artist Lance Garavi. While individual works of art, however genius, may have value, they won't do the trick. What we need is for all art to be about climate change.
And with whatever skill set we have.
Exactly. I just happen to be an artist.
Yeah, and artists are good at speculative fiction. They're good at lateral connections between different complexities. They're good at metaphor. There's all kinds of things that artists and are doing. And and when I say must, I say it with the respect that of artistic freedom. And I've had conversations about that with some of my colleagues who say, well, you can't tell artists what to do. No, but you can make it easier for them to have more impact. And those who want to be, I use the word education because I'm self-educating myself through this podcast and other ways. It's not that hard to find the knowledge that's there. I know the Echo and Arts Network is going to publish a book soon with lots of information. There's those kinds of tools, but then you have to have the time, right? Because a lot of artists are struggling to make a living, and so how can I take on climate change when I can barely pay the rent? Especially now with COVID.
Well, yeah, one of the things there is, when it comes to being an artist, for me anyway, it wasn't a career choice.
Right.
I couldn't help it.
You've done well.
It's just, I don't know, financially I'd have done a lot better being a scientist. I was quite good at that at school. I was quite good at engineering. I was quite good at math. And there's lots of other things if I actually wanted to make money that I could have done. But in terms of my actual practice as well, what I have learned to do, and this is my practice, is actually to focus on making space. And this became clear to me when I read Leela, An Inquiry into Morals by Robert Pirsig. Towards the end of the book, he suggests that the most moral act of all is to create the space for life to move onwards. And it was one of those sentences that just rang true with me, and I've held on to that ever since and pursued the making of space, not the filling of it. So when I say I work with ecology, I try to work with whole systems, ecosystems. So the things within an ecosystem are the elements with which I try to work. I try not to introduce anything other than what is already there. In other words, making the space as habitat for new ways of thinking, habitat for biodiversity to enrich itself, habitat for other ways of approaching things. There's an old scientific adage about nature abhors a vacuum, and that vacuum is the space as I see it. So in terms of where I am at my age in my career, I see that a lot of what the early eco-artists set out to do has actually been achieved. We don't need to be made further aware. Everybody in the world knows that climate change exists. They know of its perils. Some people are actually experiencing those disasters regularly as a normal way of living. What we need to be able to do is to move on from that, and in my opinion, facilitate, support, encourage the younger generation to be able to ask new questions, to be able to move forward from where we are now.
Activist Naomi Klein. What the climate needs to avoid collapse is a contraction in humanity's use of resources. And what our economic model demands to avoid collapse is unfettered expansion. Only one of these sets of rules can be changed, and it's not the laws of nature.
in their own way, and with whichever collaborators they choose to work with, because
Totally.
there's a lot more. I mean, I use the example of my daughter who's studying science now, but who's very fluid across, and her generation are very fluid across fields of activity. They're more literate than I will ever be, just because of the access to information that they've had, and also the sense of need. I mean, you need to know a lot to be not just have a job in life, but to actually be relevant, to be impactful. And so I'm glad that you're an educator, because that's a role that many of us play in one way or another in teaching, but also, as you said earlier, listening to what different generations have to say, and then kind of pulling it together.
Yeah.
I also think I agree we're beyond the awareness phase. Some are even before awareness, but most of us are on the cusp of awareness and action, or awareness, something indefinable in action, because an unreflected action, well, I've done my part, I've recycled my, plastic that's actually going into landfill, not very helpful, though the process of engaging with an act is useful. But then what is the real impact? So here in Canada, we're talking about activating in a much more organized way, the way the UK has in many ways, with Julie's Bicycle and Creative Carbon Scotland and all the organizations that you have there that are very, very well structured. So, and I'm glad you've already answered many of my questions in terms of what we need to do. You don't have to repeat it over and over. It's pretty straightforward, that people need to look at themselves and figure out where they can contribute most honestly and with the most effectiveness. And that might be at the voting booth. It might be through their art practice. It might be in the way that they associate themselves in their communities and local activities. David Haley, is there anything else you wanted to add? Because I'm so enriched already by what you said. Thank you.
It was interesting that also the use of the metaphors of war.
Mm-hmm.
The work that I did, Greenhouse Britain, with Helen Mayer Harrison and Newton Harrison, there was a lovely scientist phoned up one evening and said, David, look, we're already doing managed retreat. We know about sea level rise, and the government has already put managed retreat into place. What are you bringing that's new? And I said, well, we've changed the metaphor. Managed retreat is an engineering war set of metaphors. What we're doing is graceful withdrawal.
Mm-hmm. Tell me more about that.
Well, the word grace also means becomingness. And it also has aesthetic overtones to it, which is kind of bringing those two together is nice, I think. And withdrawal rather than retreat. So it's doing it on one's own terms, as a self-determined way, rather than a reaction to a disaster. That started to set up the way in which one might approach these things. However, I also think that your colleagues and friends are slightly using rose-colored glasses in terms of the rallying cries of World War II. Mm-hmm. There were many artists who were, in fact, depicting very dystopian images. I mean, I'll just talk about John Nash for one. Mm-hmm. And I think what your colleague was actually referring to was the jingoistic wartime posters that were designed. In fact, an old friend of mine, Games, was one of the main artists who was commissioned to design the posters. But they came from a media, and it's still the media that is shaping, unfortunately, present culture in that respect. So artists are still left potentially with a dystopian perspective. And I think going back to reality, one of the issues that we are not tackling is that we're taking a dystopian view upon our individual activities that creates guilt syndromes and neuroses, which of course means that the systems of power are working. And in terms of actually addressing the power, speaking truth to power, we need to name the names. We need to name Standard Oil and RG Farben, who now call themselves ESSO, Chevron, Mobil, DuPont, BP, Bayer, Monsanto, BASF, Pfizer, and so on. These are the people that control the governments that we think we're voting for, and the pretense of democracy that follows them. Until those organizations actually rescind their power to a regenerational way of doing and thinking, we're stuffed, putting it bluntly.
Oh, I hear you. I'm speaking later today with the filmmaker Jennifer Abbott, who worked on the film The Corporation and the New Corporation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Which is really brilliant work about the unfathomable, the unbelievable, let's say, influence and power that corporations have over our lives, much more than people are aware.
Yes.
Both in their legal and their relationships to government and power.
Yeah.
So it's terrifying what you're saying, because the magnitude of change is so overwhelming for an individual. But then maybe that individual shouldn't get caught up in their own. I like the word guilt you use. Of my personal dystopia, and think more collectively. How can collective voices make a difference? And you don't have to be Extinction Rebellion necessarily, though that is a movement. That's a choice. But there are different paths for people to be active and protest the destruction of our planet, which is what's happening. Yeah.
Again, diversity is the key word. The one thing possibly that such organizations as Climate Emergency Unit and so on could follow is actually to unite, because a lot of energy is actually spent in disparate actions and multiplying the same actions. Whereas if all these organizations actually united, they might actually present a force for power.
Well, I think that's the intention. You might be referring to Seth Klein's book, A Good War, and the Climate Emergency Unit that he set up. And there are other similar activities, but that's one I'm involved in personally. And the idea is to rally. And the word rally can be problematic, but in the best sense of rallying, to bring together people of like mind and to unite. I don't know if it's uniting yet, but it's certainly coordinating efforts across sectors, economic sectors, policy, and arts and culture is one of the sectors that he and others are interested in mobilizing. And the word mobilization implies simply moving forward in some kind of concerted way. And I think that's happening, and it's also happening in the U.S. More so than it was under the previous government. So there's a window of time. They keep saying, it's 10 years, but it really, the next few years are critical, which is one of the reasons I retired and chose to work on this full time, because there's work that we can do that can be very impactful. And I love what you said about creating space for life to move forward. That's exactly what I'm feeling. I don't know if I'm thinking it. Now that I've heard the words, I connect the words with my emotions, but that's what I'm feeling needs to be done.
Law professor Shalanda Baker. Will we redesign systems to replicate the current structures of power and control? Or will we reimagine our systems to benefit those who are so often left out of discussions regarding systems design?
Yeah, it's also perhaps as an addition to the idea of rallying is emancipation.
Okay.
Because all of the different sectors that you've talked about still retain white man's power. And it would be good to see greater connection, genuine connection for the emancipation of people of color, people of different ethnicities, actually being engaged in this stuff. But I think many of them feel disenfranchised by academia, by the arts world, by politics per se, and by governments. So again, it's through the emancipation of peoples across the planet that I think we might be able to work towards a united regeneration. With a bit of luck.
Writer Rebecca Solnit. Hope locates itself in the premises that we don't know what will happen, and that in the spaciousness of uncertainty is room to act.
Yeah, and a lot of effort and circumstance. I mean, some might have seen COVID coming, but it came as a surprise to most of the world population. And now we're talking about just recovery. We're talking about concepts that are very powerful. In fact, one of the quotes in my reality program is Rebecca Solnit talking about uncertainty or incertitude, which is a concept that artists are very familiar with, right? Because you don't quite know where you're going with an artwork, and yet it's going to move in a certain direction. Yes, I find some comfort in that, but I like the idea of emancipation in the broadest sense of disempowering not disempowering, but sharing the power. Shifting.
Shifting the power.
Fair enough. Shifting the power.
Because sharing the power is what the United Nations tries to do.
Right.
And I won't go into my full writings on that particular subject, but sharing the power basically doesn't work. The idea about lifting people out of poverty to be and look like us actually does completely the opposite.
It's an ongoing colonial approach.
Exactly. Why would they want to look like us?
Right. Or do things like us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Who assumes that what we're doing is correct and good? Well, yes, because we have the money and we have the power.
Yeah.
And again, it rests in power. Well,
we've covered quite a bit of ground. Is there anything we haven't talked about? Life.
Well, absolutely. It's at the end of the day, art is only one bit of life, and it's the bit that I grew up with. As I said, I couldn't help it; I just did it. And my thing from 1992 was, as I said, it was all about science, politics, and economics. So, what could I do as an artist? And I'm still trying to find out.
Well, fair enough. Well, I encourage people to, there's a website of yours, I think it's David Haley. What is it exactly?
davidhaley.uk.
Okay. Well, I encourage people to read your reflections and obviously to listen. People might want to listen to this podcast twice because there's nice gems of thought and references that people could then, I'll try to put some in the program notes, but just so that they can benefit from your experience, right? Because you've obviously been thinking about these things for a while and have had your failures as well, I'm sure. And then you kind of can see through the muck, right? That's why I appreciate the clarity of your. Well, you and others have created a body of work, which is good because then you can look at the art and it speaks for itself. But also the discourse and just the ongoing conversations that we need to have. As honestly and as vulnerably, with as much vulnerability as possible. Sure. Every time I speak, I feel vulnerable because I'm about to say something that maybe I'm not so sure about. But there you go. It's out there. People can listen to it, agree, disagree, and then we move forward, hopefully together.
Yeah. Indeed. That's the idea.
All right. Well, thank you, David Haley, for your time today. And we will talk again, I'm sure.
Thank you, Claude. It's really nice to meet you. Take care.